While this is the first visit to Cuba by President Obama, many Americans have already had the chance to visit the Caribbean nations since the travel embargo was lifted last year. We're joined by 3 USC students tonight who had the chance to visit Cuba and are here to tell us about their experience. We have Rita, Neha, and Caitlin. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
So, Neha, I know that you visited Cuba before the trade embargo was lifted. How was the experience getting into Cuba pre-embargo?
So I went legally. I have a U.S. passport, and my family and I were very interested in having the opportunity to see what Cuba was like. So we actually applied through the Department of Treasury, which it was a program called Insight Cuba, and it was basically an educational program that allowed us to visit the country under the guise of being on an educational trip. So it took a lot of steps, but we made it in smoothly.
Now, Rita, was your experience any different from that of Neha's? Because I know you went after the embargo was lifted.
Well, I would say very different. Like, first of all, I hold a Chinese passport. That's what makes everything different. We basically traveled to Mexico first, and we filled a form in the airport and buy a visa right at the boarding gate before we go to Cuba, and that's it.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I know that the food there is kind of legendary. What was your experiences like in terms of food? Caitlin?
I think the food is great there. I live in a host family, and then the lady who made the food for us, she's awesome. She made like the fried banana. She had the fried chicken, which is actually I think the combination between Chinese food and American food. So it's very good.
Neha, what was your experience like with food pre-embargo lift?
So I'm jealous because my experience is a little different. Before they opened up relations between the two countries, and I think probably till this day, there's a ration system in Cuba, the same way that you would have in any communist country. So there were private restaurants called paladars that you could visit, and they had awesome Cuban food, like the type that you hear, that you think of when you hear Cuban cuisine. But for the most part, anytime we went to a government-sponsored restaurant, which was predominant in the country, it wasn't what you think of when you think of, a great Cuban sandwich.
Now, in terms of pricing, how was it? Was it relatively cheap or relatively expensive, Rita?
Well, they use 2 different currencies right now. Like for tourists, it will require one currency called cuc, and 1 cuc equals $1. So I would say it's not quite cheap. But I heard that among local people, they are using a currency called Cuba pesos, which is much cheaper than cuc.
I gotcha. Now, last question. Did you try any of the Cuban cigars?
I would say yes. Because we went pre-embargo lift, we weren't allowed to bring Cuban rum, Cuban cigars, or chocolate out of the country. I think those are the things that they're the most famous for, so we weren't allowed to take any of that with us. So while we were there, with my dad and my brother and my mom, we smoked a few Cuban cigars.
Rita, Caitlin, did you?
Unfortunately, no.
Well, thank you so much for telling me about each of your experiences, and thank you for being here. Now, back to you, Priscilla.